Lovely to talk with you, Jodie.
Thank you.
Let's talk initially about Indigenous communities. You've been a very senior leader in government in Indigenous services and Department of Aboriginal Affairs in New South Wales. What experiences have you had, observations have you made about the vulnerabilities of older Indigenous Australians?
Well, there's probably several. I mean, one I spoke about was around racism itself, and that Aboriginal people report racism having a significant impact on their lives. And that of itself then reduces people's access to services right across the board and gives them a different experience of services and service providers. So that actually is a barrier for people accessing services, talking to whether it's authorities or doctors or something about what might be happening with them. So there's that resistance and barrier to them reporting elder abuse. So I think that whole context of history that Aboriginal people live in, the trauma they've experienced, whether, as stolen generation and as colonialism, does have an impact now on how they relate to service providers, particularly if they're not community-controlled service providers. So I think that of itself, does sort of, it puts up that sort of barrier about whether people access services, report abuses, those sorts of things, and makes them much more vulnerable.
And when we've been talking about elder abuse more broadly across the community, the focus typically is on that difficult thing to talk about, which is abuse within families by adult children.
Yes.
Is that a feature of Indigenous life as well?
So anecdotally, one of the things that came up yesterday was about financial abuse, and anecdotally you'll hear that a lot of elders in communities are, having young people come to them and take their money from them, often to feed an addiction of one sort or another. But also this is, is this a cultural sort of construct as well, that you share everything? But taking the money off elderly people who may be, not have anything else, I think is a form of abuse. And anecdotally, you'd see that is happening. The sort of services that were presented yesterday, so I think they're Aboriginal Community Care in South Australia, doing a lot of work around, I suppose, empowering elderly people to speak up, but also giving them information about what their rights are, particularly when there might be abuse in the family. Another point I made during my speech is that we do expect Aboriginal people quite often not to move into facilities, so they'll be taken care of in the home, which probably puts them at risk. But at the same time, there's not a lot of training and support for the carers in those homes. So have those carers, often who might be a granddaughter or a grandson or something like that, been trained in looking after that elderly person? And I don't think that the support and training is there. And so just knowing about things like nutrition for elderly people, dehydration and how that could affect an elderly person, how to manage their diabetes, those sorts of things. So the carers aren't actually being trained either. And that can be perceived as an abuse or a neglect.
Now, with your Red Cross hat on, how much exposure do your staff and volunteers have to elderly Australians in New South Wales and ACT?
Yeah, so a lot of our programs have that interface with elderly people. So in New South Wales, we would make calls to about 1,300 clients every single day. Those calls are made by volunteers to check on their well-being. Basically, it's a very quick call every morning to see if they're okay, and we use those calls also then to just some other key messages around heat waves and things like that. Are you looking after yourselves? Is there is someone going to check on you later today? Are you drinking enough? Can you go and sit somewhere cool today? All of those sorts of things. So we get those other key messages out. But we also activate if that person doesn't answer that phone call. There's a process of 3 calls, 10 minutes apart. If no one answers, we go into activation mode, both another contact person or ultimately the police or ambulance or something like that. And we often, it does actually prevent more serious incidents. We do sometimes find people who have passed away, but it's more that you might find someone who's had a fall in the bathroom or something like that, and they would pass away if they were left there much longer. So it is one of those really critical programs. We also have programs where volunteers visit people in aged care facilities. We have another program called Mates where we match volunteers to an elderly person to go and have a chat with them once a week. So it's really about reducing that social isolation. And in the context of this conference, there is obviously the possibility of identifying elder abuse. And I think that's probably an area we could still do some more work in terms of making sure our staff and volunteers are well trained in that space.
So their priority, these wonderful people who make the telephone calls and the staff and those delivering Meals on Wheels and the ACT, obviously their priorities are very much the physical and emotional well-being of
right.
people, and they're very much attuned to that, presumably through their training and just their many years of experience.
Yeah.
Do they come to you, or do leaders in your organisation come to you and say, we've got this odd situation where we think this thing that we can't quite put our finger on is happening, but client won't really disclose? Is that happening?
Not that I'm aware of. And I think
Is that because you're not looking for it, or...?
that could be part of it. I think it's probably, as I said, I think it's an area that we could actually do some more developmental work in. Where we have probably more chance of that occurring is, so the daily wellbeing call is quite a short, sharp, how are you, what are you doing today, that sort of thing. A lot of elders sign up for something a bit more than that, so it's a bit more of a social connection. It's a longer call, it's a bit of a chat about how they're going, and I think there's much more possibility of things being disclosed in that environment. You've got to remember, if I put aside the mates and the visiting in facilities, if you're on the phone to someone, you actually haven't met them often, so whether you would be prepared to disclose in that instance, and whether it's appropriate for us to ask those sort of questions. But I think if people were probably expressing some concerns, then there is a sort of process to actually report that and put that through the activation.
It's interesting that it's up to you to imagine it. There isn't kind of a set of national benchmarks and architecture that says, if you were dealing with children, that you would, of course, ask a vulnerable family, try and sniff out any concerns that you might have, and if you found them, you'd report them. So that there'd be real clarity around that, whereas you're kind of grappling to imagine what it is that you might institute.
Might do, that's right.
It's interesting, the distinction, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I think, so we run some other programs, so our Young Parents program down at Randwick, where, obviously tightly regulated and controlled and accredited. Everyone's got working with children checks. It's there's all of those sort of regulations and protections in place. Obviously, for our volunteers going to ring or visiting elderly people, there is police checks in place, but we haven't got that other side of it as well. And people are volunteering, sometimes they might volunteer just to do 5 phone calls a week. So it's about what burden do we put on our volunteers as well. The volunteering in and of itself is a big part of keeping people connected and reducing social isolation. So a lot of our volunteers are there because they actually want to contribute and be valued and contribute to society. So I was talking about a group of elders out in Blacktown that we have helped set up, all Aboriginal elders, so it was identified that we weren't connecting with a lot of isolated Aboriginal people, and they've set themselves up as a group of volunteers. They do phone calls to other Aboriginal people to check on them. I mean, it's really fantastic when you go to Yarbon and they meet them on a stall, so we've had a stall the last few years at Yarbon, and some people might be passing and meet the Aboriginal elders there and, you've been ringing me, put a face to the name. So, we have to make sure that our services are culturally appropriate and accessible as well. I think there's a risk that services from a lot of service providers aren't actually accessible, or we haven't really done the work to say, what does this group specifically need, as opposed to the broader population.
And how hard is it for you, as a leader of Red Cross in those two areas, to try and come up with answers for your own organisation, not exactly in absence of any kind of national framework and benchmarking, but I mean, it's pretty limited, isn't it?
Look, I think there's a lot of support out there, and we do have, this program's not just in New South Wales, it's right across Australia, and we have our own systems and processes, obviously. And as I said, we do use key messages. We've not gone out with key messages about elder abuse, and that might be an area that's lacking on our side. So we have messages about
But if there was
heat waves.
if there was a law that
Yeah.
put on the books that talked
Yep,
about elder abuse,
Yeah,
if there was an ombudsman,
statutory reporting and those sorts of things, yes.
if you had an ombudsman whose function was to investigate financial abuse of elders, if you had these kind of headline national reforms,
Yes.
would that make your job of imagining your role a little easier?
Yes. So obviously where you've got children's commissioners and things like that, and there is those sort of regulations, it does give you a very straight line about what you need to be alert to, how you identify it, all of those sorts of things.
A path to follow.
Yeah, that's right. So it would actually give you that framework to work within. As I said, for a lot of our programs, they are that sort of lighter touch, and it may not be appropriate in those instances. But the people who might be visiting elderly people in nursing homes, for instance, I think that would be a completely different matter.
So lots of work to do.
Lots of work to do, always.
Thanks so much for talking.
You're welcome.